The rifles' bullets fired in sequence while their casings flew through the school hallways, filling with violence a place where children should be learning. The Israeli soldiers advanced, hunting down the Hamas men who had hidden there, making the combat a special and intimate challenge. In the narrow hallways, the Palestinian fighters also had their strategies, lurking through the ruins with their RPGs until they found a defenseless tank for their attacks. They also targeted distracted soldiers who fell into terrifying ambushes. It was just another month of fighting in Gaza. October 7, 2023 would forever be known around the world as the day Hamas left Gaza and invaded Israel to kill more than 1,000 people. In an operation that challenged all Israeli intelligence and caused widespread panic in the country, the response was to invade Gaza in search of the terrorists, creating a war of new proportions. In the bloody and endless disasters, Hamas killed women, children, and the elderly. They filmed everything on October 7 and showed it off with pride. Still, there were those who denied the deeds or tried to justify them. Israel killed thousands with the bombings, many of them innocent, but so many people justified it simply as casualties of war. There were crimes on both sides, which only fueled the fire of the cauldron of hatred even more. With Gaza under blockade by Israel and Egypt since 2007, information became increasingly complicated with highly biased sources. Hamas, for example, reported the number of wounded and dead through its Ministry of Health. Israel also came up with its own numbers. Both sources were known for lying multiple times during the conflict.
For decades, with the propaganda war spreading around the world, the expansion was so great that several protests began to occur.
American university students concerned about the Palestinians took over parts of the universities, occupying the premises and preventing students and professors from entering. In addition to often being violent toward Jews, anti-Semitic acts spread around the world. It took months for these university students to be removed by the authorities. They went there to then protest on social media with exclusive focus on Palestine, which might have prevented them from protesting against the Rohingya massacres, the thousands of children killed in the Yemen crisis, and the bloody events in Sudan. Even Turkey expressed its shock at the massacre in Gaza. But forgetting the genocide it caused in Armenia and supporting Azerbaijan, draining Nagorno-Karabakh and later expelling the Armenian residents. Israel was also not far from this hypocrisy. Its warnings for the Palestinians to relocate didn't help much. The troops moved and airstrikes began to occur in various parts of the Gaza Strip. The propaganda about providing humanitarian aid was nothing compared to the destruction happening throughout the region. Killing, destroying homes, and leaving people increasingly desperate in search of water and food. International pressure led to a truce mediated by Qatar. On November 24th, fighting stopped in the Gaza Strip and hostages were exchanged between Israel and Hamas. Obviously, the hostage exchange was tense, with the propaganda war ignoring the ceasefire and keeping its volleys on social media at full force. Hamas warned that about 2,000 Palestinians were being held in Israeli prisons without any formal charges. And those who are charged face a conviction rate of over 99%. In Israeli military courts, Israel released hundreds of them, and many spoke about poor treatment and torture. The Israelis released by Hamas gave similar testimonies. The aunt of a released 12-year-old hostage stated that the child was assaulted by Hamas fighters, adding that crying children were threatened with weapons to stay. The violence reported by kidnapped women was often treated as a lie and put on trial by pro-Palestinian sources. Like everything in this war, there was denial that these facts had happened. Originally scheduled for 4 days, the truce was extended several times from November 24 to 30. Hostages and prisoners were released. On November 27, the catalog announced a 2-day extension. Mutual accusations of violations occurred on November 28. The story of this video begins after that truce at the beginning of December 2023 when the shooting resumed. The Israeli Defense Forces had occupied much of northern Gaza in December 2023. The entire coastline had the presence of Israeli soldiers as well as a strip further south, creating a blockade. The army mobilized in Beit Hanum, searching houses and bringing reinforcements to Gaza, confident that they had control over the region. The Merkava tanks were one of the foundations of the ground advance. The 12.7mm Browning M2 machine gun fired together with a 120mm cannon to break through Hamas positions, including locations where soldiers from this group emerged from tunnels to attack. These open paths allowed the soldiers to move among the ruins of houses and buildings, entering places where they believed they might find enemy fighters. The airstrikes set fire to suspected locations, breaking the resistance in Beit Hanun and other regions, but Hamas was still there. There were too many tunnels from which their men emerged to watch tanks roam the dirt roads, smell the dust rising, and wait for the right moment to rush out and place explosives at one of the weak points of the Merkava. Adrenaline was running high in their blood. As they grabbed the rocket-propelled grenade for the final explosion, they filmed the fire spreading and then fled into the tunnels to avoid retaliation. The sneaky tactic worked very well for the soldiers. They walked among the ruins, passing the RPGs to each other, dressed as civilians. Despite Hamas's ample resources and the videos showing militants in uniform, many were young, moving skillfully until they found the Merkava, which would suffer from the impact of yet another rocket-propelled grenade. They weren't always able to stay hidden in the ruins. Israeli drones saw these groups moving through the streets. The men were followed by the cameras from the attack all the way to their hideout. The tank might have seemed easy to destroy, but the truth was that the Merkava was an efficient machine of destruction. It tracked enemy soldiers according to the drone's information, without having the kamikazes as predators. In widespread use, like in Ukraine, the armored vehicle freely fired its rounds at the buildings where Hamas had moved. Any sign of enemies was countered with the 120-meter rounds flying to turn the target into rubble and debris. Hamas's effort was to move through entire isolated apartments. The men crawled on the ground carrying their version of the rocket-propelled grenade 7. That's how it was. The team got ready to fire the projectile at another tank, but they were spotted. Before that, the Merkava roared at its possible predators, filling the apartment where they were with smoke. Even with some groups exposing themselves unnecessarily, Hamas had many other assets, using their tunnels to reach much more hidden routes. Fighters went through the walls, looked for openings no matter how small to aim their RPGs, and some kept moving through the streets to find their targets. The shots enveloped the tanks in smoke while the soldiers of the Is al-Din al-Qassam brigades returned to their tunnels. These fighters, still in their civilian clothes, walked along the walls of the standing buildings up to where there were signs of IDF's men. Inside an apartment, they spotted their bones covered in the shadows with confirmation of at least 3. The rocket-propelled grenade was placed on the shoulder and the warhead aimed at the apartment. The window burst into flames, throwing fragments inside. The AKs were raised in the hands of the Hamas men, starting the volley of shots. The Israeli soldiers were at risk the whole time. The Hamas troops could be anywhere. The fighters watched the soldiers approaching and took advantage of their carelessness in gathering together in an open field. The rocket-propelled grenade shot traveled through the air with a trail of smoke, narrowly missing the soldiers. They ran for cover, chased by AKs firing with calibers as varied as their clothing. Shots hit the buildings, searching for the flesh of the Israelis. The RPGs also came in to try to finish the job. Their explosions brought out the colors orange, red, and yellow, followed by gray smoke that rolled over the Israelis. Many of these men were pinned down during the ambushes, feeling the brutality of the attacks and having to tend to the wounded. Huddled against the walls, the soldiers who were still standing fired everything they had in their rifles to keep Hamas at bay until support arrived. It was a tough task, not knowing when new RPGs would be launched or if more enemy men would appear. Then, when the Al-Qassam Brigade was forced to retreat, they would fall back to their rear positions. The drones, which managed to capture the Hamas soldiers retreating, followed the men to find the entrances to the tunnels. When they saw that they were about to enter the escape route, the shots fell at what would have been the enemy soldiers' moment of relief. While they tried to use the space, more men would die from the bombs. The soldiers of the Al-Qassam Brigade knew about the risk from the drones. Most of the time, they couldn't be seen up above. That's why when walking in the open field, stepping over rubble, moving slowly, they felt chills on the back of their necks, they were being watched, and death would descend on them from the sky. The Israel Defense Forces needed to take care of those tunnels. Their drones went first, scouting the way. Their search was relentless, with dogs sniffing out the enemies throughout Gaza. Their sharp noses led the way between the houses, with the soldiers following close behind. The problem was that many times they were being watched as well. When they set up their equipment to check the tunnels, Hamas already had their eyes on them, waiting for the soldiers to expose themselves. That's when their men would come out of the tunnels to try to cause terror, retreating only when they saw the gunfire coming back. One idea was to start pumping seawater to flood those underground passages as a way to ruin those routes without the need for large explosions. It seemed strange at first, but soon after, Hamas released a video of its men listening to the frightening noise. Fleeing through the tunnel, the men were hit by water in their chests and almost drowned in the middle of the tunnel. That's what happened. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, or UNRWA, was supposed to provide support, assistance, and human development services for Palestinian refugees. UNRWA's mandate includes Palestinians who fled or were expelled during the Nakba, the 1948 Palestine War and subsequent conflicts. In addition to their descendants, including legally adopted children, there were agency schools in Gaza, and one of them, a member of Hamas, acted against Israeli troops. His shots were aimed at the soldiers just below. The exchange of gunfire took place in mid-December 2023. The IDFs got tired of the problem and activated the drone to put an end to the enemy's audacity. The explosion put an end to the ambitions of another Al-Qassam Brigade militant. However, that was not enough for the Israelis. A serious feud had developed between UNRWA and Israel, with accusations that it was unclear where the agency ended and Hamas began. Because of this, one of their schools was blown up so that, according to Israeli officials, it would no longer be used. The Israel Defense Forces infantry sought cover in the mounds of earth marked by the tracks of armored vehicles. These squads ran among the ruins of the battlefield that Gaza has become. Those attentive to their training stopped only when they had cover, raising their rifles to hunt down Hamas fighters. Walking through the alleys was terrifying. Ambushes were constant, with shots coming from every direction. It took focus and physical readiness to risk crossing open fields, running toward the next ruins. Anywhere, another fight could break out, so rifles had to be loaded for the ammunition to keep searching for blood. A shot from a killer exploded in a building used by Hamas. Those 90 millimeters of fury were made to blow up defenses and buildings. The rifles rose with the shots piercing through the smoke. M4A1 or Tavor fired the 5.56 millimeter projectiles. Machine guns like the Negev with the same caliber caused damage in the direction of the buildings. When the work was finished in one place, the squad was sent to another. In a war where the fighting never stopped and the fear of ambushes was constant, the soldiers who were standing still slowed down and rarely had a proper place to rest. Exhaustion made them make mistakes like being within sight of Hamas's sharp eyes. A second to catch their breath after so much fighting and carrying the weight of war was enough. Light on their feet, the Hamas soldiers moved through the buildings. With the RPGs, the window opened to the landscape, which brought a nervous smile to the Palestinian fighter. The rocket-propelled grenade flew quickly across the distance between them, its smoke trail visible until it exploded against the wall behind the Israelis. The men were stunned and injured by the fragments from the explosion. Hamas's modus operandi changed a bit in the fight against the armored vehicles. The anti-tank squads continued their routes through the ruins, setting up the RPGs, and so to operate persistently. Any mound of earth was a shelter, or it could just be a passage to a tunnel that put the Hamas fighter face to face with a Merkava. All this initiative did not yield the results that the Al-Qassam brigade boasted about. The defense instruments, the armored vehicles, worked well. The system detected the approach of the projectile and activated the release of the penetrators, which formed the defense matrix, detonating the rocket-propelled grenade round. Hamas knew that the armored vehicle had some kind of problem. The neutralization of the system could be achieved through two different methods: firing a rocket-propelled grenade 7 from less than 50 meters away, or using a weapon capable of firing supersonic projectiles. The brigades would then send their soldiers to risk themselves at close range and record the attacks. Many times these men recorded their own deaths while trying to advance against the Trophilos. It couldn't always work out. Some of them were spotted before their shots could hit anyone. The Israeli rifles were aimed at a Palestinian fighter, and he ducked down again for protection. The soldiers on the surface kept their rifles pointed at him and prepared the grenades. The suppression left the soldiers unable to react until the men approached with the explosive, which detonated inside the hole. Israel's advances continued from the north of Gaza. The terrible explosions brought down many of the buildings. As the army advanced to carry out organized evacuations of civilians, Israel implemented a grid-based system. A map was distributed along with leaflets containing a QR code. However, the lack of electricity and internet made it difficult to access the map. Because of this, some of the evacuation instructions lacked clarity and contained contradictions. To make matters worse, Israel attacked areas that it had designated as safe for the evacuation of the population. Even so, thousands of Palestinians were reported returning to their homes in areas still under combat despite other warnings. Also in December, Israel reached the centers of Khan Yunis, Jabalia, and Shuja'iyah. There were images of yet another stage of the disagreements between the Israel Defense Forces and UNRWA. A grenade launcher fired at Hamas men inside the agency's school. The rifles of the 108th Brigade fired their rounds at the rooms where the enemy soldiers were hiding. Shell casings flew and scattered across the floor, each step in the dangerous advance to enter a room. Hamas was waiting there, ready to drive their projectiles into enemy flesh. But the soldiers of the 188th were prepared. Suppressing the adversaries, they reloaded quickly, sending more shells flying in the end. With the area secured, the men went to analyze what Hamas was doing there. The Israel Defense Forces claimed there was a tunnel at the site. Soldiers claimed to have found weapons in schools, noting that many of them were used as shelters for civilians. In Khan Yunis, a tough battle by the reconnaissance battalion of Israel's 55th Brigade ended with the bodies of Hamas men scattered throughout a school run by the agency. Weapons were filmed on the same floor where enemy blood was spread. After so many exchanges of gunfire, the brutality of Israel's advances took its toll, adding to the soldiers' paranoia about ambushes. On December 15, the IDFs announced that they had killed 3 of their own civilians by friendly fire. The soldiers mistakenly identified 3 Israeli hostages as a threat during operations and opened fire, killing them according to an IDF's official. On December 16, they were shirtless and carrying a stick with a white cloth. When an Israeli soldier, who declared them terrorists after feeling threatened, opened fire, killing 2 and wounding the 3rd, who was killed by Israeli reinforcements, the deaths continued their steady escalation in December. Palestinian civilians had few places to go. According to the Israelis, Hamas kept moving into areas that were supposed to be safe. The Israel Defense Forces accused that, since the designation of a humanitarian zone for civilians in the Gaza Strip, on October 18, 116 rockets were fired from that area toward Israel, with 38 falling inside Gaza itself. In fact, more and more images have emerged of Hamas engaging in suspicious actions regarding the civilian population, such as placing hostages in non-combatant homes or using hospitals as bases. The Israelis kept reaffirming that the statistics were inflated, that Hamas was putting people under 18 to fight and counting them as children killed. Nevertheless, there were many civilian deaths, regardless of the fact that so many of the recorded fatalities were Hamas soldiers. The tragedy had no end date, it never did, ever. There were only moments when the number of likes on social media wasn't enough to spark protests at universities. But there were also explosions of violence and announced wars, which led to news reports and angry posts from selective consciences. Children would keep dying in Gaza, women crying for their children in the midst of misery, Israeli soldiers dying in this invasion, desperate relatives longing for their kidnapped loved ones, and boys dreaming of becoming martyrs for a cause funded by leaders wallowing in blood-stained dirty money. Far away from there, leaders who knew that the continuation of the conflict was important for their survival and wealth on both sides. It was the war that brought deaths in the Middle East and likes at universities.